Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present. I'm grateful to be here, at least with you virtually. The title of my talk is Formalizing Heuristics, Cognitive Strategies for Decisions Under Constraint. This work is co-authored by John Pittner and myself. Together, we started from a simple but important question. How do humans and machines actually make decisions when they're under stress and information is limited? The idea was, what if we could capture those quick rules, which folks call heuristics, in a way that's rigorous enough for ontology, but still flexible enough to work in real world systems? Now, most of us are familiar with heuristics as little shortcuts our brains take when making decisions. They're everywhere, from choosing a route to work, to diagnosing patients in the field, to deciding how to allocate scarce computing resources. But there's the catch. While heuristics are powerful, they're also hard to pin down formally. They've mostly been treated as either psychological quirks or as informal rules. What we try to do in our paper is take heuristics more seriously as directive information content entities, formal structures that can be modeled, reasoned over, reused by both humans and machines, so they're not just described, but computable, auditable, and reusable across domains like medicine, defense, and AI. That's a core contribution to heuristic decision ontology, and that's what the heuristic decision ontology attempts to do. So let's begin with a simple question. Why do heuristics matter in the first place? Well, you see heuristics everywhere, from daily choices to crisis decisions. They enable action under pressure and uncertainty. They prevent paralysis when complexity explodes. So imagine, if you will, you're a medic in a mass casualty scenario. You arrive on scene and there are 20 patients spread out in front of you. Some are unconscious, some are screaming, some are walking around dazed. You don't have lab tests. You don't have time for detailed vitals. You have minutes, maybe seconds, to decide who gets care first. Full deliberation is impossible. So what do you rely on? Well, you rely on heuristics. Quick rules like, if the patient isn't breathing, open the airway. If they still don't breathe, tag it black. That's a heuristic, a shortcut that makes action possible under pressure. And it isn't just medics. Heuristics show up everywhere, and they're absolutely critical in scenarios where the cost of hesitation can be lives, mission, or massive financial loss. One way to think about heuristics is as the opposite of perfectionism. They don't aim for the perfect answer. They aim for a good enough answer fast. And in many real world environments, a fast, good enough decision is far better than a slow, optimal one that comes too late. So now that we've seen why heuristics are essential, let's look more closely at what makes them powerful and where some risks lie. Now that we've established why heuristics matter, let's unpack what they actually are and what makes them useful. At their core, heuristics are quick, practical rules for decision making. They don't pretend to cover every possibility or to optimize across all data. Instead, they zero on the most relevant cues available in the moment and provide a shortcut to action. That speed and simplicity is exactly what makes them powerful. They deliver the good enough solution when optimal isn't possible. In theory, if we had unlimited time information, we could calculate the optimal choice in every scenario. But in practice, whether it's a medic in a triage, a pilot in an emergency, or an AI system making a split-second classification, we rarely have the luxury of perfect information or infinite time. Heuristics are the bridge between what's ideal and what's possible. And crucially, heuristics reduce cognitive load and simplify choices. Think of it like this. Your mind or your system has a limited bandwidth. Every bit of information you process consumes resources. A well-chosen heuristic doesn't just juggle everything. It cuts down the inputs to just a few salient factors. That makes it possible to decide even under extreme pressure. So the strengths are clear: fast, simple, usable under constraint, but speed always comes with a trade-off. So we've talked about heuristics as quick, practical rules. But to really understand them, we need to ask four main questions. When do they emerge? Why do they work? What risks do they bring? And what do they enable? First, heuristics show up precisely when conditions are constrained, when there's scarce time, missing data, or deep uncertainty. That's why you don't notice them as much in slow, deliberative problem solving. It's when the clock is ticking and information is incomplete that heuristics step to the forefront. Second, because they focus and cut through noise. In complex environments, there's often too much information, not too little. Heuristics work by stripping away the clutter, allowing you to hone in on just the cues that matter for the decision at hand. But third, Speed isn't free. Speed can bring bias and error. The availability heuristic, for example, may cause us to overestimate risks that are vivid in memory, even if they are statistically rare. Recency bias may make an investor chase last month's winners, ignoring longer-term trends. A doctor might anchor their first impression of a patient and miss contradictory evidence. These aren't random mistakes. These are systematic risks. They come from relying on shortcuts. So what do they enable? Despite the risk, heuristic enable decisive action despite constraints. So let's walk through a concrete example of heuristics in action. Imagine you're a medic in a mass casualty scenario. You arrive on scene, and you're faced with dozens of patients scattered around you. Some are unconscious, some are screaming, some are walking around. You have only seconds to make life or death decisions. Using the simple triage rapid treatment or START method gives you simple, clear rules of thumb if a patient is unconscious. But breathing, you tag them red, meaning they need urgent care. If a patient is vocal but stable, you tag them yellow, meaning they can wait. If a patient is walking, you tag them green, meaning they have minor injuries. These are not deep diagnostic evaluations. They are snap decisions based on quick, practical rules that cut through complexity and hone in on the most critical signals. That's what heuristics do. They let you act fast when time and data are scarce. And importantly, when I use the word cognitive in this talk, I don't mean exclusively human cognition. What we're talking about are the agent-neutral bounded reasoning strategies. These are shortcuts that can be used by medics, but also by AI systems, autonomous agents, or decision support tools. They're strategies for operating under bounded rationality, regardless of whether the agent is biological or artificial. From Aristotle's notion of practical wisdom all the way to modern triage rules, heuristics have always been bridging the gap between limited resources and urgent action. They are rules for acting when time is short, stakes are high, and complexity is overwhelming. Picture yourself in the medic's shoes. How long would you last if you tried to deliberate optimally for each patient? You'd freeze. The power of heuristics is that they prevent that paralysis and keep decision-making moving. So heuristics clearly matter. But the way they've been studied has focused on two competing perspectives: heuristics as sources of biases and heuristics as adaptive strategies. Let's take a look at both. We've just seen how heuristics operate in a concrete way, like in the START triage scenario. But this brings us to a problem state that motivates some of our work. While procedural models of heuristics exist, and while there are taxonomies that list and describe them, no prior work has provided with formally axiomatized upper ontology line representation that links prescriptive content to decision processes. In other words, we don't have a way yet in a machine-readable and logically rigorous way to say this specific heuristic prescribes this specific decision process under constraint. But ontologically, where do those rules live? How do we relate the process they guide? And how do we formally distinguish between heuristic, a best practice, or a protocol? Without an axiomatized representation, these remain just mere loose descriptions. This is the core problem statement. Heuristics are everywhere, but they're under-modeled. They're often treated informally in psychology, implicitly in cognitive architectures, or descriptively in taxonomies. What's missing is an ontological framework that treats heuristics as structured, prescriptive information entities, connects them directly to the process that they shape, and of course makes them interoperable with existing ontologies. To move forward, we have to reconcile two big perspectives from cognitive sciences, one that sees heuristics as biases and one that sees them as adaptive rationality. Let's look at those next. To really understand why heuristics matter and why modeling them is challenging, we need to look at two different perspectives that have shaped the field. The first is the work of Kamen and Tversky, who introduced the heuristic and biases framework in the 70s. From their point of view, heuristics are essentially shortcuts that often lead to systematic errors in judgment. Think of anchoring, where people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they see, or availability, where recent or vivid examples distort our sense of probability. Their experiments show that when we lean on heuristics, we deviate in predictable ways from what's called normative rationality. So in this view, heuristics are mostly a liability. They explain why we get things wrong. The second perspective comes from Gegendresser and his colleagues. For them, heuristics are not just flaws, but adaptive strategies. Instead of focusing on errors, they emphasize how heuristics allow agents to make good decisions quickly given the environment. For example, a firefighter might decide to evacuate a building because it suddenly feels wrong to stay inside. That's not irrational. It's an adaptive response to subtle cues. In this framework, heuristics are ecologically rational. They exploit the structure of the environment to produce effective outcomes with limited time and information. So we end up with two perspectives. Heuristics as biases, shortcuts that systematically distort our judgment, and heuristics as adaptive strategies, shortcuts that help us act effectively under constraint. What's interesting that both are true. Heuristics can mislead, and heuristics can save lives. The real challenge is to represent them in a way that captures both dimensions, the risk of bias and the potential for adaptation. So then, how do we resolve this tension? So far, we've seen the practical importance of heuristics, and we've traced two different perspectives on what they are. Biases on one hand, adaptive strategy on the other. The challenge and the problem statement we look at now is that no one has yet represented heuristics formally in a way that bridges those perspectives and supports real-world use case in complex system. By building a formal ontological framework, we can treat heuristics as first-class entities, not just as labels or procedural rules. In turn, our work aligns with two key standards, BFO 2020, an ISO standard, and the Common Core Ontologies, or CCO 2.0. This gives us semantic interoperability with existing efforts. Second, the ontology gives us an upper-level scaffold. The scaffold is critical because heuristics have both sides as instructions, but they also prescribe processes. Third, the ontology allows us to formalize heuristics as directive information content entities, or DICEs. This matters as a DICE doesn't just describe, it prescribes. It tells an agent what to do under certain conditions. That's exactly what a heuristic is. Finally, the ontology ensures extensibility and reasoning support. Once heuristics are in the framework, we can query them, validate them, and extend the ontology with the heuristics as they emerge without breaking the structure. So this isn't just a classification exercise. It's about making heuristics computable, reusable, and auditable. It's about giving us the tools to ask which heuristics are being applied, under what conditions. Do they deviate from normative process, or do they exploit the environmental constraints? At the center of our framework is a heuristic instruction. We define heuristic instruction as a DICE that prescribes a rule for choosing under uncertainty and limited resources. It tells an agent how to act when time, data, and cognitive resources are constrained. Think of it as a formal version of a field manual or a playbook. A heuristic instruction reduces cognitive effort by narrowing down inputs and guiding behavior quickly. Now, we've organized these instructions into four main families, each representing a distinctive way that heuristics shape decision-making. Exploratory heuristics. These are about seeking new cues when the usual routine doesn't fit. Decision simplification heuristic. These are the most familiar. They reduce complexity by focusing on salient cues. Examples include availability heuristic, relying on what comes to mind most easily, or the anchoring heuristic, starting from an initial reference point and adjusting from there. We also include related forms like recognition, default, effort, and representative heuristics. There's also the family of temporal heuristics. These depend on timing. And of course, social heuristics. These rely on the behaviors of others. Together, these families cover a wide range of bounded reasoning strategies. Each family is represented as a subclass of heuristic instruction in the ontology, and each specific heuristic can be added as more fine-grained subclasses. That way, the ontology stays flexible and extensible. Now that we've defined heuristic instruction as prescriptive rules, the next step is to show how they connect to processes. Here we rely on the BFO scaffolding. In BFO, a process is an occurrent, something that unfolds over time. What we've done in heuristic decision ontology extended the idea with a new class, the heuristic guided process. A heuristic guided process is exactly what it sounds like, a process that is prescribed by a specific heuristic instruction. It's the behavioral side of the equation. Now, within the broader class, we define a key subclass, the heuristic decision-making process. This is when the heuristic guided activity culminates in a choice between alternatives. Think about a medic who has to decide whether a patient is red, yellow, or green in the triage scenario. That's a decision-making process guided by heuristic. The family shown here is the decision simplification process. These processes reduce complexity by focusing on a few salient cues under conditions of constraint. And we've identified several named subclasses: the availability-based decision process, anchoring-based decision process, default effect decision process, effort-based decision process, recognition decision process, and representativeness decision process. Each of these subclasses is linked formally to the corresponding heuristic construction. We design these processes so that they apply not only to human agents, but also artificial agents. Any entity making bounded rational decisions, whether a medic, a commander, or an AI system, can instantiate a heuristic guided process. To see this in action, let's walk through availability heuristic example applied in the triage context. A medic at a mass casualty event sees a patient with chest pain, shortness of breath, and pallor. A vivid recent case comes to mind. Acting on that recall, the medic tags the patient as red, high priority. Ontologically, here's what's happening. The availability heuristic is a heuristic construction of DICE. The decision activity is an availability-based decision process subclass of a heuristic guided process. That process is guided by the heuristic. Now, in the ontology itself, the representation is actually richer. We've modeled additional relationships. A heuristic guided process may deviate from a normative decision-making process that essentially attempts to capture the possibility of bias. It may also exploit the structure of the environment. That captures the possibility of adaptation. The point is, the ontology seeks to unify both perspectives, heuristics as biases and heuristic as adaptive strategies. So, we end where we began. Heuristics matter because they make decisions possible under constraint. By modeling them formally, we make them traceable, explainable, and reusable. As we wrap up, let me bring the threads together. We began with the problem of heuristics. They're everywhere in medicine, defense, and AI systems. But until now, they've been modeled informally. Sometimes they're treated as quirks of psychology, sometimes as procedural rules and architectures, sometimes as lists in taxonomies. What was missing was the formal ontological framework. That's what the heuristic decision ontology attempts to provide. By representing heuristics as directive information content entities, we've made them computable, auditable, and reusable. We can now say that the heuristic instruction guides the heuristic guided process. And by modeling additional relations, such as when a process deviates from normative decision procedures or exploits the structure of an environment, we unify two longstanding perspectives. Kamen and Tversky were right. Heuristics can lead to biases. And Gigenzer was right. Heuristics can also be adaptive strategies. Our ontology shows that both are true depending on context. The payoff is practical. In medicine, triage decisions can now be traced and audited, supporting training, accountability, and system design. In defense, time-critical command decisions can be modeled transparently. In AI, we can design better systems that use heuristics. And more broadly, this framework advances the practice of applied ontology. It takes something as elusive as the rules of thumb and gives them formal structure, showing that ontology is not just an abstract exercise, it's a tool for modeling real-world cognition under constraint. So if you just take one idea away from this talk, let it be this: that heuristics are not accidents of the mind. They're structured, prescriptive entities. And when we model them formally, we just don't understand them. We make them traceable, explainable, and usable across domains. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions or would like to engage with me on this topic, please do not hesitate to reach out to me directly. I look forward to future discussions about heuristics and how the heuristic decision ontology can support. Thank you.